It was a chilly autumn morning at Riverside Academy, and Principal Lee was already feeling the weight of another challenging day. The historic building's paint was peeling, the computers in the lab were outdated, and the budget meetings had become increasingly depressing. But she kept going, driven by her love for the students and her belief in their potential. As she walked through the hallways, checking on classrooms and greeting students with her usual warm smile, she couldn't help but notice the worn-out carpets and flickering fluorescent lights. The school needed help, desperately. But private schools like Riverside weren't exactly at the top of anyone's funding list these days. The morning had been particularly hectic. The coffee machine in the teacher's lounge had broken down. Again, 3 students had gotten into an argument about a TikTok video, and the physics teacher had called in sick. Principal Lee had just finished arranging for a substitute when her office phone rang with news of another budget cut. She was rubbing her temples, trying to figure out how to make ends meet, when movement at the front entrance caught her eye through the security camera feed on her desktop. A man in worn jeans, a black t-shirt, and a red baseball cap was walking in, looking around curiously. In normal times, she might have looked more carefully at his face or noticed his expensive watch and the Tesla key card hanging from his neck. But these weren't normal times. The school had been dealing with political tensions lately. Just last week, they'd had to break up a heated argument between parents at a PTA meeting. Principal Lee had worked hard to maintain Riverside as a neutral space where education came first. The sight of what she assumed was another political statement walking through her school's doors made her heart sink. Without thinking twice, she hurried down the hallway, her sensible shoes clicking against the old tiles. Students turned to watch. It wasn't often they saw their usually composed principal moving so quickly. She caught up with the visitor just as he was examining the student artwork displayed on the walls. "Excuse me, sir," she said firmly, trying to keep her voice level despite her frustration. "I need to ask you to leave. We have a strict policy about political expressions in school." The man turned, seeming surprised. He opened his mouth to speak, but Principal Lee was already in full protection mode. "I understand you might have something to say, but this is a place of learning. We need to keep our personal politics outside these walls." "Actually, I'm here for a meeting," the man started to explain, his voice oddly familiar. But Principal Lee was too focused on maintaining order to really listen. "I'm sure you are," she said, her tone professional but firm. "But I'll have to ask you to reschedule, without the hat. We can't make exceptions to our rules, even for parents or visitors." The man looked like he was about to say something else, but instead, he just nodded slowly, a strange little smile playing at the corners of his mouth. He turned and walked back toward the entrance, pulling out his phone as he went. Principal Lee watched him leave, feeling both relieved and somehow uneasy. Something about his calm reaction and that slight smile made her wonder if she'd missed something important. But there was no time to dwell on it. The school bell was ringing, and she had a million other fires to put out before lunch. Little did she know, this brief encounter would completely change the future of Riverside Academy and teach her one of the most valuable lessons of her career about jumping to conclusions. The rest of the morning at Riverside Academy was a blur of activity, but Principal Lee couldn't shake off a nagging feeling about the man in the red cap. She tried to focus on her tasks, helping a student with college application forms, mediating a disagreement between 2 science teachers about lab equipment sharing, and reviewing the cafeteria's budget proposals. During her lunch break, she sat at her desk picking at a salad while scrolling through her emails. The maintenance report wasn't looking good. The heating system might not make it through another winter. She sighed, pushing aside her half-eaten lunch. The school's financial situation kept her up at night these days. A knock on her door interrupted her thoughts. It was Mrs. Rodriguez, the front desk secretary, looking flustered. "Principal Lee, I just got the strangest call," she said, twisting her hands nervously. Someone from Tesla's education division was asking about rescheduling a meeting that was supposed to happen this morning. They mentioned something about their CEO. Principal Lee's fork clattered to her desk. their CEO. She repeated weakly, her mind racing back to the man in the cap. The casual clothes, the expensive watch, the Tesla key card she'd barely registered. It all suddenly clicked into place. She quickly pulled up the news on her computer, and there he was, the same man she'd turned away, photographed at a recent tech conference wearing the exact same red cap. But it wasn't a political statement at all. It was a limited edition SpaceX cap he was known for wearing to school visits. Her stomach did a flip. She'd just kicked out one of the world's most influential tech innovators, someone who could have potentially helped their struggling school. And she'd done it without even letting him explain himself. "Oh no," she whispered, slumping in her chair. Mrs. Rodriguez hovered uncertainly by the door. "Should I try to reschedule?" she asked carefully. Principal Lee nodded, feeling her face grow hot with embarrassment. "Yes, please. And maybe we should prepare some kind of apology." But before Mrs. Rodriguez could reply, another staff member burst in. "Principal Lee, the board just called an emergency meeting for this afternoon. They said it's urgent, something about new ownership." The day was quickly turning into something out of a bizarre dream. Principal Lee looked at the clock. It was only 1 p.m., but she felt like she'd aged a year since morning. She straightened her blazer, took a deep breath, and tried to collect herself. Whatever was coming, she'd face it with professionalism, even if she'd just made the biggest mistake of her career. As she walked to the conference room, students waved and smiled at her. Little Andy from 3rd grade showed her his perfect math test, and the high school debate team excitedly told her about their upcoming competition. These moments usually brightened her day, but now they just reminded her of what she might have cost them because of her hasty judgment. The board members were already gathering in the conference room when she arrived. Through the glass walls, she could see serious expressions and hushed conversations. Someone had brought in a projector and was setting up a presentation. The board president caught her eye and gave her an unreadable look. Principal Lee took another deep breath and reached for the door handle. Whatever happened next, she'd own up to her mistake. After all, isn't that what they taught their students? To admit their errors and learn from them. Little did she know, this afternoon's meeting would bring news that would change everything. Not just for her, but for the entire Riverside Academy community. And maybe, just maybe, her biggest mistake would turn into an unexpected second chance. The conference room fell silent as Principal Lee took her seat at the long wooden table. The afternoon sun streamed through the windows, casting long shadows across the concerned faces of the board members. She could feel her heart pounding against her ribs, but years of handling school crises had taught her to maintain a calm exterior. "Thank you all for coming on such short notice," the board president began, adjusting his glasses. "We have some significant news about Riverside Academy's future." He paused, clicking through his presentation to reveal a sleek corporate logo. "As of this morning, our school has been acquired by the Future Minds Education Foundation." Principal Lee's mouth went dry. She'd heard of the foundation. It was a newly established organization dedicated to revolutionizing education through technology. The rumors about their funding had been making waves in educational circles for weeks. "The foundation has plans to transform Riverside into a model school for modern education," the board president continued. "They're preparing to invest millions in upgrading our facilities, implementing new programs, and providing cutting-edge resources for our students." Under different circumstances, this would have been the best news Principal Lee had heard in years. But something in the board president's expression told her there was more to come. "The foundation's founder was actually here this morning for an initial tour," he said, and Principal Lee felt her stomach drop. "Unfortunately, there seems to have been a misunderstanding." The room grew even quieter, if that was possible. Principal Lee could hear the old clock on the wall ticking away, marking each excruciating second. "The founder. Well, I believe most of you would recognize him from the news. He's been making headlines lately for his innovative approaches to education and technology." The board president clicked to the next slide, and there he was, the same man she turned away, standing in front of a rocket launch pad, wearing that same red cap. Several board members gasped. Someone whispered, "Is that really him?" Another muttered, "The richest man in tech, right here at Riverside." Principal Lee felt her face burning. She started, but the board president held up a hand. "We've already received an email from him," he said, and to Principal Lee's surprise, there was a hint of amusement in his voice. "Would you like to hear what he wrote?" She nodded, not trusting herself to speak. The board president cleared his throat and read from his tablet. "I had an interesting experience at Riverside today that convinced me we've chosen the right school. Your principal's commitment to maintaining a neutral learning environment, even when faced with what she perceived as a challenge to that neutrality, shows exactly the kind of dedication to principles we're looking for. I look forward to working with an administrator who puts students first, even if it means standing up to someone she thinks might cause disruption." Principal Lee blinked, hardly daring to believe what she was hearing. Around the table, tense expressions were melting into smiles of relief and even a few chuckles. "He's actually requested another meeting," the board president continued, "this time at his company headquarters. He wants to discuss your vision for the school's future, Principal Lee." The relief that washed over her was so intense it made her dizzy. Not only had she not ruined everything, but somehow her mistake had actually impressed their new owner. She found herself laughing softly at the irony of it all. As the meeting continued with discussions of preliminary plans and potential changes, Principal Lee's mind wandered to her students. Wait until they heard that their little struggling school was about to become a pioneer in educational innovation. All because of a misunderstanding about a hat. Sometimes, she reflected, the biggest mistakes could lead to the most amazing opportunities. And maybe that was the best lesson of all. After the board meeting, Principal Lee stayed late in her office, trying to process everything that had happened. The sun had already set, casting her office in the soft glow of her desk lamp. She was about to pack up when her computer chimed with a new email notification. Her breath caught when she saw the sender's name. With slightly shaky hands, she clicked to open it, not quite sure what to expect. "Dear Principal Lee," the email began simply. "I hope this finds you well. First, let me properly introduce myself, since our earlier meeting was cut a bit short." She couldn't help but smile at his gentle humor. The email continued in a surprisingly casual tone, as if he was chatting with an old friend rather than writing to someone who'd just kicked him out of their school. "That red cap has actually caused quite a few mix-ups," he wrote. "It's my lucky SpaceX hat from our first successful rocket landing. I probably should have thought twice about wearing it to a school visit, but I was running late after a morning launch meeting and grabbed it without thinking." Principal Lee found herself relaxing as she read on. He described how he'd become interested in Riverside Academy after reading about their robotics club's success despite limited resources. The students had built a working robot from recycled parts and almost made it to the state championships. "That kind of innovation and determination is exactly what we're looking for," the email continued. "And honestly, your reaction this morning only confirmed that Riverside is the right choice. It's rare to find someone willing to stand their ground for what they believe is right for their students, even when facing an unknown situation." He went on to share his vision for the school, not as a flashy tech showcase, but as a place where traditional education and innovation could work together. He mentioned ideas about solar-powered classrooms, a student-run repair shop for local computers, and coding classes that would help kids create solutions for real community problems. "But these are just ideas," he wrote. "I'd really like to hear your thoughts. Would you be willing to meet again? This time, I promise to leave the controversial headwear at home," he joked. Principal Lee found herself chuckling out loud at that last line. The knot of anxiety she'd been carrying all day finally began to loosen. She read the email again, noting how he'd taken the time to research their school and acknowledge their existing achievements, not just sweep in with grand plans for change. Looking around her office, she noticed all the little details with new eyes, the wall of student artwork, the science fair trophies won against all odds, the thank you cards from graduates who'd gone on to college despite the odds. Maybe this was exactly the kind of partnership Riverside needed. She began typing her reply, her fingers flying over the keyboard as she shared her own hopes for the school. She told him about the brilliant math student who helped younger kids with homework while his mom worked late shifts, about the art teacher who bought supplies with her own money, about the janitor who stayed late to help the robotics club test their projects. Before she knew it, she'd written a long, heartfelt response about what made Riverside special and what it could become with the right support. She hesitated for a moment before hitting send, wondering if she'd been too honest, too passionate. Then she remembered how he'd appreciated her standing up for her principles that morning. Taking a deep breath, she clicked send and leaned back in her chair, feeling like she'd just opened a door to something extraordinary. As she finally packed up to leave, she noticed a group of students still working in the library across the hall. They were huddled around a broken laptop, determined to fix it for their history presentation tomorrow. Principal Lee smiled, knowing that soon, stories like this wouldn't be about making do with what they had. They'd be about seeing what they could create with real resources behind their determination. Sometimes the best connections start with a misunderstanding, and sometimes standing up for what you believe in leads to exactly where you need to be. A week later, Principal Lee found herself standing in front of the massive SpaceX headquarters, her heart doing little flips in her chest. The building looked like something out of a sci-fi movie, all gleaming glass and sleek metal. A friendly security guard checked her ID and directed her to the main entrance, where a young assistant was waiting. Principal Lee, we're so glad you could make it, the assistant beamed, leading her through the bustling lobby. Everywhere she looked, there were screens displaying rocket designs and people hurrying around with tablets and blueprints. It was like stepping into the future. Is that an actual rocket engine? She couldn't help asking, pointing to a massive piece of machinery displayed in the corner. Good eye, a familiar voice called out. She turned to see their new owner walking toward her, wearing a simple black t-shirt and jeans, and notably, no cap. His eyes crinkled with amusement. That's from our first successful landing. Kind of like my lucky hat, but a bit harder to wear to meetings. Principal Lee felt herself relax at his casual joke about their first encounter. He led her to a conference room, but instead of the formal meeting she'd expected, she found a space that looked more like a classroom. The walls were covered with whiteboards, filled with calculations and drawings, and in the center was a table with what looked like. Are those robot parts? She asked, spotting familiar components similar to what her students used in robotics club. I thought we could talk while building something, he explained, pulling up a chair. I've found people are more honest when their hands are busy. Plus, I wanted to see these teaching methods you mentioned in your email, the ones you use to help students learn complex concepts through hands-on projects. For the next 2 hours, they talked about education while assembling a small robot. Principal Lee shared stories about her students, like the kid who struggled with reading but could fix any computer you put in front of him, or the girl who taught herself coding to create a website for her grandmother's small business. He listened intently, asking questions and sharing his own ideas. When she mentioned the challenges of teaching STEM to students who didn't have computers at home, his eyes lit up. What if we created a program where students build their own computers? He suggested, carefully connecting 2 wires. They'd learn hardware basics, plus they'd have a computer to keep. Principal Lee's mind raced with possibilities. We could partner with local tech companies for parts. Maybe even set up a student-run repair service for the community. Exactly, he exclaimed, nearly knocking over their half-built robot in excitement. This is what education should be: practical, engaging, and connected to real life. As they worked, she found herself sharing more of her dreams for Riverside: solar-powered classrooms, a maker's space, coding workshops for parents. Instead of dismissing her ideas as too ambitious, he kept building on them, suggesting ways to make them happen. You know, he said, as they finished assembling their robot. When I first thought about buying a school, people told me to look at fancy private academies. But I'm wanting to find a place with heart, where innovation comes from necessity and determination. He pressed a button, and their little robot whirred to life, rolling across the table. Somewhere like Riverside. Looking at their creation, Principal Lee felt tears pricking at her eyes. This wasn't just about getting new computers or fancy equipment. This was about giving her students the chance to dream bigger than they ever had before. "Ready to change some lives?" he asked, holding out his hand. She shook it firmly, thinking of all the possibilities ahead. "More than ready," she replied, and she meant it with all her heart. As they walked out, he picked up a red SpaceX cap from his desk and held it out to her with a grin. "A reminder," he said, "that sometimes our biggest mistakes lead to our greatest opportunities." She took it, laughing. Sometimes life's best moments come when you least expect them, even if they start with kicking a billionaire out of your school. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of activity at Riverside Academy. Principal Lee found herself working late into the evening with their new owner, spread across her office floor, surrounded by building plans and curriculum ideas. Empty coffee cups and half-eaten sandwiches littered her desk as they mapped out their vision for the school's future. "What if we turned this old storage room into a creative lab?" she suggested one evening, pointing to a spot on the blueprints. She could hardly believe how comfortable she'd become sharing ideas with one of the world's most famous tech innovators. The robotics club's been storing their equipment in different classrooms, and the art teacher needs more space for projects. He looked up from his tablet, eyes bright with interest. "We could knock down this wall," he said, tracing a line on the plans. "Make it one big innovation space. Art, technology, engineering, all flowing together. That's how real creativity works anyway." Their planning sessions often drew curious onlookers. Students would peek through the office windows, whispering excitedly when they spotted the famous tech entrepreneur sitting cross-legged on the floor, sleeves rolled up, deeply engaged in discussion with their principal. But what really touched Principal Lee's heart was how he always took time to listen to their ideas too. Like when little Tommy from 5th grade burst in, forgetting to knock in his excitement about an idea for a solar-powered lunch table where kids could charge their devices. Instead of dismissing him, their new owner pulled out a fresh piece of paper and asked Tommy to draw his design. "See that?" he said to Principal Lee after Tommy left, clutching his drawing proudly. "That's exactly what we're aiming for. Students who don't just use technology, but dream up new ways to make it work for their community." They decided to start with the basics. The ancient heating system would be replaced with a smart climate control system that students could help monitor and maintain. The flickering fluorescent lights would give way to natural lighting solutions designed by the physics class. Even the cafeteria would become a learning space, with students helping to design and implement a sustainable food program. "But what about the teachers?" Principal Lee asked one night, voicing a concern that had been nagging at her. "All these changes, will they feel overwhelmed?" He nodded thoughtfully, taking a sip of his now cold coffee. "That's why we'll start with teacher training and support. Each teacher gets to help design their new classroom. We'll bring in experts to help them adapt their teaching styles, not replace them. This isn't about throwing out the old. It's about enhancing what already works." The more they planned, the more Principal Lee realized this wasn't just about turning Riverside into a fancy tech school. It was about creating a place where innovation served a purpose, making learning more accessible, engaging, and meaningful for every student. One evening, as they were wrapping up another marathon planning session, he noticed her staring at the old photo wall in her office, pictures of graduating classes going back decades. "Having second thoughts?" he asked gently. She shook her head, smiling. "Just thinking about all the students who've passed through these halls, working so hard with so little. And now," she gestured at their plans, "it feels almost unreal." "You know what sold me on Riverside?" he said, gathering up their scattered papers. "Not the building or the location, or even the potential for innovation. It was watching that student fixing his friend's laptop in the library that first day, using spare parts and determination. That's the spirit we're building on. Principal Lee nodded, thinking of all the times she'd seen her students and teachers make magic happen with limited resources. Now they would have the tools to match their determination. As she locked up her office that night, she paused to look at the red SpaceX cap now hanging by her door. From crisis to opportunity, from misunderstanding to partnership, sometimes the best plans come from the most unexpected beginnings. And this was just the beginning. Change came to Riverside Academy not like a tidal wave, but like a sunrise, gradual, warm, and full of promise. The first signs appeared in small ways. Fresh paint brightening the hallways, new computers arriving in sleek boxes, and construction crews starting work on the weekends. The old storage room transformation became everyone's favorite project to watch. Students would gather at the windows during lunch, pointing excitedly as walls came down and new equipment arrived. Their new owner often joined them, answering endless questions about the robots and 3D printers being installed. Will we really get to use all of this? One wide-eyed 7th grader asked, pressing his nose against the glass as a massive laser cutter was carefully positioned. Use it? You'll be teaching others how to use it, their owner replied with a grin. We're counting on you kids to figure out things we adults haven't even thought of yet. Principal Lee watched these interactions with a full heart. She'd worried the changes might feel overwhelming, but instead, they seemed to be awakening something in her students, a sense of possibility, of ownership, of pride. The teachers, too, were blossoming. Mrs. P, who'd been teaching math for 30 years, nearly cried when she saw her new interactive classroom. I've been dreaming of teaching geometry this way, she said, playing with the holographic display. Now my students can actually see shapes transform in 3D space. The science lab became a wonderland of discovery. Gone were the days of sharing 3 microscopes between 30 students. Now each station had its own equipment, and the back wall housed a real-time connection to research laboratories around the world. Students could watch actual scientists at work and even ask them questions. But it wasn't just about the fancy new technology. The changes went deeper. The cafeteria's new greenhouse program had students learning about nutrition and sustainability while growing food for their own lunches. The art room's digital studio opened up new possibilities for creativity, blending traditional techniques with modern tools. One morning, Principal Lee arrived to find a group of high school students huddled around a laptop in the new innovation lab. They were designing a simple robotic arm to help their classmate, who had injured his wrist playing basketball. We figured out how to 3D print most of the parts, one student explained proudly. And we're using the coding skills from our new computer science class to program it. That same afternoon, she passed the elementary wing to find young students teaching senior citizens from the local community center how to use tablets. The older folks had been interested in learning technology, but felt intimidated by formal classes. The kids, with their natural enthusiasm and patience, made perfect teachers. The robotics club, once crammed into a corner of the science lab, now had a proper workspace. They were already preparing for the state championships, their new equipment letting them compete on equal footing with the most expensive private schools. But Principal Lee's favorite moment came during a regular Tuesday afternoon. She walked into the innovation lab to find their owner sitting cross-legged on the floor with a group of students. They were troubleshooting a robot that wasn't working quite right. See, sometimes the most important innovations come from things going wrong, he was saying, pointing to a loose wire. That's how we learn, by solving real problems. Looking around the room, Principal Lee saw the future they'd dreamed about coming to life. Students were scattered in comfortable working spaces, some coding, others sketching designs, a few building prototypes. The walls were covered with project plans and inspirational quotes. Sunlight streamed through the new energy-efficient windows, and the whole space hummed with creative energy. A student's excited, "It works," brought her back to the moment. The robot had sprung to life, rolling smoothly across the floor while its creators cheered. Their owner high-fived each student, his face as bright with joy as theirs. This, Principal Lee realized, was what education should be, not just teaching facts and figures, but lighting up minds with possibilities. And it had all started with a misunderstanding about a red cap. Word about the changes at Riverside Academy spread through the community like wildfire. What started as curious whispers at the local coffee shop turned into excited conversations at grocery stores and community centers. Parents who'd been considering moving their kids to other districts were now calling daily to ask about enrollment. The local newspaper ran a front-page story about the school's transformation. They featured photos of students working in the new innovation lab. But what really caught people's attention were the stories of how these changes were affecting real lives. Like the story of the quiet boy who barely spoke in class, but came alive when he started teaching senior citizens how to use computers at the school's new community tech center. Or the single mom who could now attend parent-teacher conferences virtually during her work breaks using the school's new communication system. It's not just about the fancy equipment, Principal Lee explained to a group of visiting educators one morning. It's about breaking down barriers. She showed them how students who couldn't afford tutoring were now getting help through the school's online homework support program, accessible from any smartphone. The most amazing changes weren't happening inside the school walls, but in the community itself. The divide between tech people and regular folks began to blur. Parents who'd been intimidated by computers were now attending weekend workshops led by their own children. Local business owners started hiring Riverside students to help modernize their shops. One Saturday morning, Principal Lee arrived at school to find a long line of people waiting outside. The student-run tech repair clinic was opening for its weekly session. Community members could bring in their broken devices, and students would fix them for free or a small donation to the school's scholarship fund. My grandson showed me how to video chat with my sister in Florida, an elderly woman told Principal Lee, beaming. I haven't seen her face in 15 years. And now we talk every Sunday after church. Even former critics were changing their minds. The parent who'd been most vocal against too much screen time now helped coordinate the school's digital literacy program after seeing how technology could bring families closer together. The transformation caught the attention of other schools too. Principals and teachers from across the state started visiting, hoping to learn from Riverside's example. But they often left surprised. It wasn't just about copying the technology. It was about building bridges between old and new, between school and community. Their owner remained involved, but in an unexpected way. Instead of just funding changes, he became part of the school's fabric. He dropped by randomly, sometimes to teach a coding class, other times just to brainstorm with students about their projects. He never wore suits or acted like a billionaire, just a passionate mentor who happened to build rockets. One evening, Principal Lee found him in the innovation lab with a group of middle schoolers. They were working on a project to help local farmers monitor soil moisture using simple sensors. These kids, he said quietly as she approached, they don't just see technology as something to play with. They see it as a way to help their community. The school's success started attracting attention from big tech companies. Several offered to donate equipment or fund programs, but Principal Lee and their owner were careful about accepting help. We want partners who understand our vision, she explained to the school board. This isn't about showing off fancy gadgets. It's about using technology to bring people together. A local business owner summed it up best during a community meeting. You know what's special about Riverside? He said, standing up to speak. They're not just teaching kids about computers. They're teaching them how to use technology to make our community stronger. And isn't that what education should be about? Looking around at the nodding heads and smiling faces, Principal Lee felt a warmth in her chest. The red cap incident that had once seemed like her biggest mistake now felt like destiny. Sometimes the best way to bring people together is to start by admitting we might have judged too quickly. 1 year to the day after the famous red cap incident, Principal Lee stood on the stage of a major educational conference. The audience was packed with teachers, administrators, and education experts from around the country. She touched the red SpaceX cap sitting on the podium, her lucky charm now, and began to tell her story. A year ago, I thought I'd made the biggest mistake of my career, she started, earning knowing chuckles from the crowd. I kicked a billionaire out of my school because I jumped to conclusions about his hat. But that mistake taught me the most valuable lesson of my life, one that I hope to share with you today. The giant screen behind her showed photos of Riverside Academy's journey. The old building with its peeling paint. The first day of renovations. Students teaching seniors how to use computers. The community tech repair clinic in action. Each image told a story of transformation. But this isn't just about how technology changed our school, she continued. It's about how looking past our first impressions changed our entire community. We learned that innovation isn't just about having the latest gadgets. It's about bringing people together to solve real problems. She told them about the grandmother who now runs a small online business with help from her grandkids. About the local diner owner who proudly uses the ordering app designed by his daughter's coding class. About the farming family whose crop yields improved thanks to student-designed monitoring systems. Our students didn't just learn to code, she explained. They learned that technology is a tool for making lives better. And they taught us adults something too, that sometimes the best way to bridge generation gaps is to admit we don't have all the answers. A video played showing their owner sitting cross-legged on the floor with students, helping them troubleshoot a robot. No designer clothes, no entourage, just a passionate mentor sharing his knowledge. He could have just written checks, Principal Lee said. Instead, he became part of our school family. He showed us that true leadership isn't about titles or money. It's about rolling up your sleeves and working together. The audience leaned forward as she shared stories about their mistakes and lessons. Like the time they realized their fancy new communication system was too complicated for some parents, so they had students create simple tutorial videos in multiple languages. Or how they learned to balance screen time with face-to-face interaction by creating tech-free zones where students could just talk and be kids. But you know what makes me proudest? She asked, her voice softening. It's not the awards our robotics team has won or the national attention our programs have received. It's watching our students use their knowledge to help others. Last week, I found a group of high schoolers teaching middle schoolers who were then teaching elementary students. The joy of learning just keeps spreading. She picked up the red cap, turning it in her hands. This cap reminds me that our biggest mistakes can become our greatest opportunities, but only if we're willing to learn from them. Only if we're brave enough to admit when we're wrong and open our minds to new possibilities. The photos on the screen changed to show Riverside today. Students of all ages working together, community members joining in school activities, teachers and kids collaborating on projects. This is what education can be, she said. Not a place where we shut doors because of our assumptions, but where we open them to new possibilities. She ended with a recent photo. The entire school community gathered on the front steps, everyone smiling, some wearing red caps of their own. So yes, I kicked out a billionaire because of his hat, she concluded with a laugh. But in doing so, I learned that true innovation isn't about technology at all. It's about people. It's about community. It's about seeing past our first impressions to the possibilities that lie beyond. The standing ovation that followed wasn't just for her speech. It was for every student, teacher, parent, and community member who had helped turn a moment of misjudgment into a movement of positive change. And somewhere in the back of the room, a man in a black t-shirt and a familiar red cap smiled, knowing that sometimes the best investments aren't measured in dollars, but in lives changed and lessons learned.